The hormones of the adrenal gland we are interested in are listed here: cortisol and the catecholamines epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we're going to talk first about the adrenal cortex, and all the hormones that are created in the adrenal cortex come from cholesterol. And the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and its physiological functions are blood glucose regulation, protein turnover, metabolism of fats. It's involved in electrolyte balance, it sets the cardiovascular tone, and is also important in injury and stress responses. If we take a cut through the adrenal gland, this is what we see. We have the capsule out on the outside, and then underneath you have the cortex, which takes up about 80% of the mass of the adrenal gland. And at the top we have the glomerulosa, which secretes aldosterone, the mineral corticoid that's responsible for stimulating sodium retention and potassium excretion. We will mention this briefly during exercise and stress. Underneath that then you have the fasciculata, which is what releases cortisol, and the next few slides will go into this in much more detail. Then you have the reticularis, which produces androgens. These are important in female physiology. In males, testosterone tends to be the main androgen, but certainly the androgens for you have physiological functions. And then at the bottom you have the medulla, which is kind of a postganglionic structure that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so here is a histology slide of the adrenal medulla, the adrenal gland, and we have the cortex here, which will release the mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and sex steroids, and then the medulla, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the synthesis of the hormones in the cortex all derive from cholesterol via a fairly elaborate metabolic pathway that requires enzymes in virtually every step. Because they're derived from cholesterol, all the hormones of the adrenal cortex are called steroid hormones. You'll notice that in the pathways, in the metabolic scheme, there are hormones themselves, like progesterone is an important hormone in reproduction. And you'll also notice that the structures of both aldosterone and cortisol are very similar. Aldosterone is known as a mineral corticoid because its effects on the kidney encourage sodium retention and potassium excretion, and cortisol is known as a glucocorticoid because of its effects on raising blood sugar. Cortisol does actually have some mineral corticoid activity because of the similar in structure between cortisol and aldosterone, but the kidney prevents excessive mineral corticoid action by cortisol by using the enzyme 11-beta hydroxydehydrogenase that then converts cortisol to corticosterone, and this then lowers the affinity for this molecule on those receptors. The other steroid hormones in this pathway then are the sex hormones that are involved in every part of sexual reproduction. So this is the control of secretion of cortisol. It's part of the hypothalamic pituitary organ axis, and it's the inputs for stimulation of the release are through the hypothalamus as a result, and these include stress, but it also has circadian rhythm, so it's important in the sleep-wake cycle. It's stimulated by feeding, anxiety and depression, and there are a bunch of neurotransmitters that will stimulate it, and also can be inhibited by neurotransmission as well. Now, the general scheme is that the CRH is produced by the hypothalamus, passed through the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, and then that will secrete ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone. And this passes into the circulation, affects the cortex, which then releases cortisol. You'll note the feedback loop. Cortisol feeds back onto the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of ACTH, but it also feeds back to the hypothalamus to inhibit CRH release as well. And so it has potent negative feedback loops. So ACTH is tropic for the cells of the adrenal cortex. It binds to an extracellular receptor and activates adenyl cyclase, increasing cyclic AMP, and this then generally increases the amount of enzymes that produce cortisol from cholesterol, increasing cholesterol esterases, increasing cholesterol transport into the mitochondria, and then increasing the enzymes that will enhance the production of intermediates. And this is facilitated by genes transcription of enzymes, P450 enzymes in the mitochondria, but also it has a tropic factor on the cortex, increases the size and number of cells in there. And excessive production of ACTH can actually lead to hyperplasia of the adrenal gland. ACTH and cortisol both have a circadian rhythm, and the circadian rhythm of cortisol is obviously tied to the release of ACTH. And so this graph shows the release of ACTH at the top, and then the observed release of cortisol, and the modeled release of cortisol based off the release of ACTH. And you can see that the two of them follow very much a similar pattern. At the end of the sleep cycle is generally when both ACTH and cortisol are highest. And that's because cortisol has a neurological element to it, which of awakening and arousal, and so it gets you up and going in the morning. And so over the course of a 24-hour day, we see the highest peak in the morning just before you get up, and then we have peaks and troughs as we go throughout the day, and then towards the time when you're going to bed is when it's at its reduced level. And these will be typical unless the person is under great stress, and obviously cortisol being an important part of the stress response. It's often called the stress hormone, and then it would be released during times of duress. If you take a bunch of data and average it over time, this is what you see from a number of patients. You get this rise and peak just before awakening, and then it declines again until you sleep and begin to wake again. And so clinically, its measurements are taken shortly after awakening in the morning to look for disturbances in the release of cortisol. So these are the properties summarized of cortisol. It's secreted from the adrenal gland, from the cells in the zona fasciculata in the cortex, and it's derived from cholesterol, so it's a steroid hormone. And this means that it's non-soluble, so it has to be bound to transport molecules in the plasma, transcortin or cortisol binding globulin, and this is how it gets from one place to the other. It's degraded in the liver, and its products are excreted by the kidneys. And then its main function is to participate in the control of metabolism, glucocorticoid effects. It's very important in maintaining blood sugar during fasting or starvation. It's involved in modulating immune response to stress. Glucocorticoids are involved in many pharmacological interventions because of their potent anti-inflammatory properties, and this is derived from the property of cortisol. And as I mentioned, it also has mineralocorticoid activities in excess because it has affinity to the same receptors that aldosterone binds to. So summarizing its metabolic effects, this slide shows it quite succinctly. Possibly its main metabolic effect is to cause proteolysis that then creates amino acids that the liver can turn into new glucose, and it also stimulates glycogen synthesis. So if you like, the cortisol, the presence of cortisol will break down your muscles, turn them into glucose, and then store that as glycogen in the liver to enable you to modulate your stress response or to give you stored efficient energy for whatever you're doing. But at the same time, it stimulates lipolysis in the adipose tissue to release free fatty acids, and it will antagonize the effects of insulin by preventing the uptake of glucose into adipose tissue and into the muscle. And so these methods, it regulates blood glucose levels. So we can see here how it actually affects the circulation of amino acids in the blood. Here we have plasma concentration on the left and blood production rate on the left underneath. And we can see that with cortisol application over 8 hours, we see that the plasma concentration of the amino acids valine, leucine, and isoleucine all increase, and the blood production rate of leucine increases as well. So it's breaking down large proteins into amino acids that then circulate as fuel source. And some of the amino acids are used more to create glucose, alanine being one of them. You can see that the blood production rate of alanine is increased with cortisol, but the plasma concentration stayed the same, and this is because it's being used to create new glucose in the liver. Up until this point, we've been mainly concerned with cortisol's glucocorticoid functions, but it has many functions around the body, and lack of cortisol can cause death pretty quickly, especially if the person becomes stressed. And some of the reasons of this is due to low blood pressure, confusion, speech impairment, and general discombobulation. And this chart shows its numerous effects around the body. It's very important in the stress response because it inhibits the inflammatory and immune responses. There's many places in the immune system where it will inhibit the proliferation of cells and the production of inflammatory mediators. And this is obviously important when someone's in their fight or flight and they get damaged. They don't get a wayward inflammatory reaction to injury. And obviously in the clinic, many glucocorticoids like dexamethasone are then used to inhibit the inflammation, and this is based around the functions of cortisol. But it has many other effects around the body. It's important in your emotional tone. Increased cortisol can cause elation. It can also cause depression, and it's important in sort of waking you up in the morning, as we've seen with the circadian clock. It's important for maintaining muscle function. Without cortisol, your muscles don't really function so well because basal levels of cortisol are required to maintain normal contractility and for maximum performance. but obviously excess cortisol was also called muscle wasting. Cortisol decreases bone formation and increases bone resorption, so it's important in bone turnover. It decreases connective tissue. It maintains the cardiac output and sets the tone for your vasculature. So without cortisol, you get hypertension. And it's important in the maturation of the fetus also. And this is because it increases the maturation of the lungs, the GI tract, the central nervous system, the skin, and it's important in the synthesis of surfactant that maintains alveolar surface tension. Another thing it will do is it will increase glomerular filtration by reducing preglomerular resistance, and this aids then in free water clearance. So this slide shows you what happens with either hyper cortisol secretion or too little of it. You get this redistribution of body fat, central obesity, but increased fat in the jowls, weight gain, fatigue, hypertension, depression and personality changes, muscle wasting, edema, a thinning of bones, glucose intolerance, and thinning of skin. And conversely, without it, you have weakness, hyperpigmentation, weight loss, hypertension because you're not able to maintain vascular tone, salt craving, and fainting. And obviously with hypercortisol secretion, these can be mimicked if someone's on steroids for too long. This picture then shows a patient suffering from Cushing syndrome, and you can see the wasting of his limbs as proteolysis is stimulated, and then this redisposition of fat in the abdomen and in the face around the jaw, and it results in thinning of skin and this sort of hyperpigmentation.